She surpasses Eris Buell in every way. V. Sovari is more talented than I am.
Stariel's eyes widened. Like most sisters, she was loath to admit when others were stronger. She would have thought Ariel, being so accustomed to being stronger than everyone, would chafe at the idea, at least a little.
Yulisandra will be more talented still, given 5 years.
That's great news, but I don't have 5 years. I don't have 1. I need you to turn this Visovari into something special by spring. The Chattel are arriving then as a show of strength to make their demands heard.
And maybe to bring down a speaker.
You will make concessions.
They wish us to start a men's school. Did I say wish? They demand. They demand recognition of their new order and the attendant seats on the council, which would make them by far the most powerful order in the Chantry. By themselves, they would have a majority in any vote that came to the floor. They demand a repeal of the marriage bans so that they may marry magi. They demand a repeal of the Aliteran Accords. The nations of Mid-Kiru will have reason to fear that we wish to return to the Alcestian magocracy. These Chattel will unite the nations against us. We're a bastion of light in a dark world, Ariel. Concessions I can countenance. Destruction I cannot.
What is it you want me to teach thee?
Stariel paused, stuck between discretion and wanting to make sure her dense sister did what needed to be done.
Like we do with every sister, help V figure out what her strengths are and train them.
Ariel's eyes widened and narrowed in a heartbeat. The girl was nearly a battle Maja, and they both knew it. In fact, Ariel's response was so swift, Stariel thought she might have suspected the order. Or maybe Ariel was just that smart. Well, there it was. As much discretion and direction as Stariel could afford to give, and still hope to retain her seat if any word of this came out. Stariel would have to keep her distance from Ariel and V, of course. Even Ariel would understand that, if she noticed. Now, to smooth things, to maintain the illusion.
You are to be commended for bringing such great talents into our fold, Sister Ariel. I don't believe 2 recruits with such potential have been brought to the Chantry for perhaps 50 years.
Stariel smiled. It was 50 years since she and Ariel had arrived.
Longer, surely.
You deserve to be rewarded. Is there anything I can get for your studies?
Absolutely.
By the time she left, Ariel had muscled Stariel into consenting to every item. Ariel hadn't even had the grace to offer something she didn't really want, so Stariel could say no and claim some small victory for her pride. Stariel sat back and looked at her hair in her mirror, wanting it to be perfect for her meeting with the Aliteran emissary. At least her blonde hair was still beautiful. She had the other sisters swearing it was magic that she could have a mane so glossy and thick and perfect. It wasn't. But it always pleased her to hear the allegation. Her mind cast back to Ariel's statement that she should be fascinated by ugly Trace Arvag, whatever her name was. Stariel frowned, the face in the mirror showing any number of unattractive lines on a dignified but quite plain face. If Ariel had a sense of humor, Stariel would suspect she were the butt of a very subtle joke.
Ariel, a sense of humor.
Now there was a joke. Kyler peered through the glass inset in the balcony door. In the darkness of the Queen's bedchamber, a couple was writhing on the Queen's bed. From their frenetic pace, they were either very close to completion or very energetic. From habit, Kyler looked at the hinges of the balcony door, then realized they could squeal like a herd of pigs and never be noticed. He looked back through the window, suddenly shy. Still going.
Oh, come on. Now you're just showing off.
A gentleman would wait. A wet boy would use the distraction. Kyler slipped inside. The woman grabbed his buttocks.
Oh, don't stop now, you fucking twist! Oh, fuck! I thought I was going to make it this time.
Tara roughly pushed the young Luke Grayson to the side.
Sorry, sis.
Kyler felt suddenly lightheaded. Luke snuggled into Tara's side and laid his head on her chest. Considering that he was substantially taller and bigger than his sister, it was oddly submissive. Kyla was struck by the difference in their ages. Luke was perhaps 17 and looked younger. Tara was 25 and looked older. How long had this been going on? Durzo had taught Kyla that when something surprised you on a job, only one question mattered.
Does this change what I have to do?
The answer now was no, unless Luke stayed all night. Kyla put aside all the speculations about what this meant and refocused. There was nothing to do but wait, so Kyla moved behind a pillar in a quiet corner of the room. Luke propped himself up on an elbow.
Sis, I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow morning. This morning, whatever.
You're going to lead your first battle. You're going to be safe. I've given the guard commands to keep you back from...
That's just it, Ter.
Luke got out of bed and began dressing.
I didn't fight at Pavel's Grove. I didn't go on any raids. I didn't fight Highlanders at Screaming Winds.
Do not bring up Logan Gaia.
But I'm the Lord Commander of the Royal Armies of Scenaria, and my experience of battle is limited to the fist fight I had with the pig keeper's boy. I was 10, he was 8. I lost, and you had him thrashed.
Generals fight with their brains. Your scouts were instrumental to our victory at Pavel's Grove.
How do you do that? You fit 2 lies into 1 sentence. It wasn't our victory. It was Logan's. Why we rule now rather than having our heads on pikes, I don't know. And I completely botched handling the scouts. Men wondered if I was trying to screw up. I was so bad they thought I was a traitor.
Who said that?
It doesn't matter.
What do you want, Luke? I've given you everything.
But that's what I'm trying to say. You've given me everything that a man might earn after a lifetime of...
What do you want?
I think we should stop.
Stop?
You and me, Ter. This. Us.
Do you still love me?
Sis.
It's a simple question.
Insanely. But if people find out, they'll install Logan in a second.
Logan won't threaten us forever.
Sis, he's a good man. A hero. You're not going to kill him.
Don't tell me how to rule, Luke.
Tara.
You listen to me. You'll bitch and moan and fret like always, and I'll take care of it, like always. I take the risks, you take the rewards. So why don't you and your conscience go fuck all the maids while I get called a slut?
You expect me to believe you didn't sleep with all those lords?
You bastard! They never laid a hand on me.
So much can be accomplished without hands. Don't do that again!
I let them call me a slut. I let you fuck other women. I wake up 2 hours before dawn on the nights you visit so a maid can change my sheets so that when my laundress, who's a Sakage spy, washes them, there's no evidence of us. Why? Because I love you. So I think I deserve a little gratitude.
I'm sorry, Tara. I'm just scared.
Go get some sleep. And come to me after your victory.
Luke's eyes lit with boyish mischief.
How about I come to you now?
No. Good night, Luke.
Please?
Good night, Luke.
After Luke left and the Queen had been asleep for half an hour, Kyla drew his Moloch dagger. Kyla studied Tara Grayson as he'd learned to study his debtors. She was a woman whose bearing and reputation were a greater part of her appeal than nature's gifts. In this unguarded, unrouged moment, she looked more like a skinny farm girl than a queen. Her lips thin, cracked, colorless, her eyebrows tiny lines, her eyelashes short, her nose slightly hooked, her milky skin marred by several pimples, her face obscured by strands of loose hair. In that moment, he couldn't help but respect Tara Grayson. She'd been born into one of the great families of Scenaria, but her spirit was indomitable. She had risen past men who despised her for her youth, her sex, her reputation. Tara Grayson hadn't become queen by accident, but here, Tara Grayson was just a woman alone, about to be woken by a nightmare. Sometimes Kyla couldn't help but pity the bastards. Durzo had taught Kyla that the best wet boy understood his debtor better than the debtor understood himself. Kyla believed it, but every time he did something calculated to inspire terror, He wondered if he was trading away his humanity. It was one thing to terrify goons. Was it different to terrify a young woman in the intimacy of her bedchamber? But Tara Grayson wasn't merely a woman. She was a queen. Her idiocy would kill thousands, and she planned to kill Logan, the rightful king. Act now, doubt later. Kylo went to the other side of Tara's bed and pulled back the covers to give himself space to sit. Caught between the necessity for patience, any rapid change would wake her, and the coldness of the room, which would have Tara reaching for blankets even in sleep, Kylo pulled back the sheet to uncover her nakedness. Kylo didn't look. If anything, he was disgusted. He wanted her off balance, vulnerable. She stirred. He schooled himself to stillness, sitting upright once more, and began to glow a cool blue, gradually brightening. Tara Grayson woke slowly, as he hoped, squinted, then opened her eyes slowly, blinked once, and all in a rush the Night Angel came into focus. Kylo sat motionless as a god and reached out only with his talent and caught Tara's throat with his first try.
A scream would be a mistake, Tara. Understood?
Eyes wide, she nodded.
Cover yourself, whore. You reek of your brother's seed.
With jerky motion, she pulled up the sheets and held them in white-knuckled fists, drawing her knees up, trembling.
While you rule my city, I demand you rule it well.
Who are you?
You will call off this attack. Garawati has no food. He cannot hold this siege.
You're here to help me save Cennaria?
I will save Cennaria with you or from you. Give me 2 days. Garawati doesn't know how bad it is in the city. He will negotiate.
He's refused me. He swore never to negotiate with a woman.
That was news to Kylo. Why wouldn't Garawashi negotiate?
Not with you, then. With Gaia.
Gaia? You're Logan's creature? You were the one who saved us in the garden during the coup. All you cared about was him. You saved him, didn't you? You saved him, and now you want him to get the glory. After all I've done to get here, you expect me to let Logan win? I'd rather die!
Tara stood haughtily and grabbed her robe from a chair.
Now I suggest...
Kylo slammed her onto the bed, straddled her, punched her solar plexus to knock the wind from her, and clamped a hand over her face. He grabbed a hairpin from her bedside table and drove it through the meat of her arm. He filled her mouth with the Kakari to keep her from screaming. He ground the hairpin back and forth, then blocked her nose with the Kakari, too. Her eyes bulged and the veins on her neck stood out as she struggled in vain to breathe. She tried to flail, but Kylo had her arms pinned with his knees. He brought the hairpin into her view, then touched the point to her forehead. Though her throat was still working convulsively, Tara Grayson stilled. Kylo traced the point of the hairpin down her forehead, between her eyes, then across the delicate skin of one eyelid. For a moment, he couldn't help but wonder what Aline would think if she saw him here, doing this. The Queen's terror sickened him, and yet he held the cruel smile on his face. He lifted the hairpin away from her eye, so she could see judgment.
You'd rather die? Really?
The sight of the alabaster seraph growing larger as the punt approached did nothing to calm Aline. If Aline had read V's letter correctly, it seemed like so long ago now, V had ringed Kylo without his permission, with the very wedding earrings Kylo had intended for Aline and himself. Aline had never been so furious for so long. She knew it was destructive. She knew it would eat her alive. Only weeks ago she'd killed a man, and she hadn't felt the wash of hatred she felt now. Aline knew she was being disobedient, holding on to her resentment, her righteous wrath, but it made her feel powerful to hate the woman who'd done her wrong. V deserved hatred. The punt docked in a small slip magically shielded from the rain, and the boatman pointed her to a line. Aline joined 24 other people, mostly women, who had come to petition the chantry. An hour later, When she gave her name and asked to see V, the sister found a note about her and sent a tyro running. Several minutes later, an older Maja with the loose skin and ill-fitting clothes of a woman who'd lost too much weight too fast came out.
Hello, Aline. My name is Sister Ariel. Come with me.
Where are you taking me?
To see Yuli and V. That's what you want, isn't it?
Many steps later, they stopped at a hospital floor with hundreds of beds, lining the circumference of the Seraph. Most of the beds were empty, but sisters with green sashes moved among those that were occupied, sometimes touching the walls, which immediately turned transparent, letting in the diffuse morning sun.
Is Yuli ill?
Sister Ariel said nothing. She led Aline past dozens of beds. Some of the girls on them had arms or legs wrapped in gauze, and here and there ancient-looking Maja slept, but most of the injured had no obvious wounds. Magical wounds, Aline supposed, didn't always leave evidence on the body. Finally, they stopped at a bed, but the woman on it wasn't Yuli. It was V. She had thought from the glimpse of the redhead on the trail that she'd never seen V before, but she had. V had been at the fateful last party at the Jodwin estate. That night, V had come as a blonde, wearing a dress that was a scandal in red. Aline remembered the swirl of emotions she'd felt that night clearly. Shock that someone would wear such revealing attire, judgment, fascination. Aline and every other man and woman hadn't been able to take her eyes off the woman. Immediately after those first emotions, without ever losing her outrage, she'd felt jealousy, longing, the sick stomach sensation of not measuring up to such beauty, wishing that she could attract such stares, and knowing she never would, and would never wear such clothes even if she could, but wishing all the same that she might just for a few moments. V was that woman, and if anything, with her glossy, flaming red hair rather than what must have been a blonde wig, V was even more striking. Then, as Aline stepped closer to the bed, she saw V's other ear. She wore a single earring, Mysteril, and gold, sparkling in the morning light coming through the walls. It was half of the exact pair of beautiful wedding earrings Aline had pointed out to Kyler. The wash of emotions Aline had already been feeling suddenly had a boulder dropped in it. This was her competition. This creature had ringed Kyler. No wonder he'd chosen her. What man wouldn't? Unnoticed, Sister Ariel had come to stand beside Aline.
When she's asleep, I see what a beautiful woman Vridiana would have been.
Aline shot a look at the sister, like she could be more beautiful.
She is brittle and sick and hard and abused. Her character is as base as her body is beautiful. You'll see when she wakes. She is a walking tragedy. The trade she was taught would wreck anyone with a soul. You know that from Kyler's experience. But V didn't just learn a sick trade. She learned under Hugh Gibbet. All too often, literally under him from the time she was a child. Whenever I, old and fat as I am, see her asleep, I still get jealous. I still forget that V's beauty has been no friend to her.
Sister Ariel paused, as if captured by a thought.
In fact, the only friend she ever had, male or female, was Jarl. And the God King compelled her to kill him.
What's wrong with her? I mean, why is she here?
Her initiation doesn't only require aptitude, it requires focus. V has aptitude to an almost appalling degree. She is as talented as she is beautiful. I was and am worried that learning that may spoil her. Learning our art properly takes patience and humility, and women with enormous talent tend to lack both. So I pushed her into the initiation immediately. With what she's done and been through in the last weeks, she had no focus at all, almost no will even to live. It was nearly a death sentence. Aline, I know V has done you great wrong. These marriage rings are ancient. I'm studying the rings now to see if it's even possible to break the bond. I don't have high hopes. And I know she confessed that she ringed Kyler when he was unconscious. The other sisters don't know that. It is considered one of the greatest crimes among us. Even if she did do it to save a country, and to save Kyler himself, V surely deserves whatever vengeance you would give her. If you choose, you should be able to wake her. If you wish to stay here at the chantry, rooms will be provided for you. If you wish to speak with Yuli, she should be finishing her morning classes in 2 hours. I will be in my room if you need me. Ask any Tyrell, any of the young women dressed in white, and they will take you wherever you wish to go.
With that, Sister Ariel left Aline alone with V. Aline looked around as the sister disappeared. There was suddenly no one else in sight. She touched the knife at her belt. She could kill V and simply leave. She'd killed now. She knew how. She squeezed her eyes tight shut.
God, I can't do this. How?
After a long moment, she unclenched her jaw, willed herself to relax, opened her eyes. V lay as before, beautiful, peaceful, graceful. But instead of imagining her again at the Jadwin estate, attracting lust and jealousy like a lodestone, Aline imagined her as a child. V had been a beautiful child in the Warrens, as Aline had been a beautiful child in the Warrens. Neither had emerged unscathed. Aline looked at V and chose to fix that child V in her mind's eye. The beautiful, carefree little girl with flame-red hair before the Warrens had sullied her.
She's never had a friend.
Aline didn't know if it was her own thought or the one God's voice, but she knew instantly what he was calling her to do. Aline was frozen to the spot.
It's too hard, God. There's no way. Not after what she's done. I want to hate her. I want to be strong. I want to make her pay.
She spoke and raged and complained about the justice of making V suffer, and through it all, the God said nothing. Yet through it, she felt his presence. And when she was finished, he was still there. And Aline knew her choice was simple. Obey or disobey. Aline sat in the chair beside V's bed and waited for her to wake. From the stairs, staring through a crack in the door, Sister Ariel breathed for the first time in what seemed like many minutes. She released her talent and eased the door shut. Another gamble, another win. She hoped her luck didn't run out anytime soon. After a 2-hour wait with the nervous master of the docks, the Macedon came to collect Solon. The Macedon was the keeper of civil order in Hokai, an office that not only put him in charge of law enforcement, but also gave him considerable political clout, as he was the only person who could investigate and search noble persons and properties. Solon recognized him.
Oshobi, you've risen in the world. So, it is you.
Oshobi Takeda wore the regalia of his office like a man who used it as armor, not ornamentation. He was perhaps 30, muscular, and imposing. He wore his plumed helm open, of course, showing the electrum rings of Clan Takeda, framing his right eye with 6 steel chains connecting behind his head to his left ear. The fishes on his helm were gilded, as was his Galeris, the leather and plate armor covering his left arm. His trident was as tall as he was. The type of net that dangled over his back, draping cloak-like from spikes on his shoulders, was usually edged with lead weights to help it spread out when thrown. Oshobi's net was weighted with small daggers. It could be used not only as a net, but as a shield or even a flail by a skilled warrior. Given the numerous scars and rippling muscles on Oshobi's bare chest, Solon guessed that a skilled warrior was exactly what Oshobi Takeda had become. He had grown into his name. Oshobi meant the Great Cat, or Tiger, but Solon remembered the older boys calling him Oshibi, little pussy. Solon couldn't imagine anyone calling him that anymore.
I request the honor of an audience with Empress Wariyamo.
It was a calculated statement, not asserting his own status and recognizing hers.
You're under arrest.
In a blink, Oshobi lifted the net from the spikes on his shoulders. He looked like he wanted an excuse to use it. The man was a cretin. Solon was a mage, and Oshobi should remember it. Of course, Solon didn't look like one. After his decade serving Duke Regnus Geyer, he looked as hard and scarred as a warrior himself, albeit one with unnaturally white hair growing in.
On what charge? I do have certain rights, Mikadon. If not as a prince, then certainly as a nobleman.
His heart fell. So Cady was furious. Should he be surprised?
Your brother gave up all the Tafusan's rights. You can walk, or I can drag you.
What did my brother do?
Solon had been at various schools learning magic for his brother's entire reign, and Dorian's prophecies had sent Solon to Sonaria at the time of Sijuran Tafusan's death. They hadn't been close. Sige was a decade older than he was, but Solon's memories of him were pleasant. Apparently, Oshobi's weren't.
That's a tough one, Oshobi.
Oshobi flicked the butt of his trident at Solon's head. Solon caught the haft squarely in his hand and looked at the Macadan contemptuously.
I'll walk.
Solon's heart was turning to lead. During Sijuran's reign, Solon had been crisscrossing mid-Kiru with Dorian and Fear, searching for Kurok, so he hadn't been surprised that he hadn't heard much from home. And then, when he'd concealed his own identity and headed to Sonaria to serve one of Dorian's prophecies, he hadn't told anyone back home where he was going. But now, the silence seemed ominous. And in the years since, he hadn't been able to dispel his ignorance. From the necessity of keeping his identity secret, Solon had avoided all Sethi he saw, and those who saw him spotted the lack of clan rings and avoided him as an exile. But even the usual news one might hear from foreigners had mostly been lacking, as though the Sethi people hadn't wanted to share anything with outsiders. But as they made their way to the castle, Solon soaked in the scents and sights of his old home, and some of his tension eased. This land was balm to him. He'd forgotten how much he missed the red hills of Agrigole. As the Macadan's stout four-wheeled chariot rolled up the cobblestone road to the imperial palace, Solon's eyes were drawn to the west. As in most cities, the approach to the palace was jammed with buildings, homes, and shops, as densely as possible. But in Set, only the eastern side of the imperial way had buildings. The west side was centuries-old vineyards, rolling over the hills in perfect rows as far as the eye could see. The grapes hung heavy on the vine, and there were men checking their ripeness. The harvest would be any day. Most kingdoms required their lords to offer a certain number of men for war every summer. In Set, the levies were needed in fall for the grapes. Already, Solon saw enormous broad baskets had been stacked at the ends of the rows. There was no need for walls to protect the vineyards. The wines of Set were its pride and its life's blood. No Sethi citizen would harm the vines, nor suffer a stranger to do so. And the theft of cuttings from these vines had precipitated war between Seth and Ladesh. The loss of half a dozen ships had been counted a small price when they successfully sank the Ladeshian merchantman that was carrying the cuttings back to Ladesh to begin rival vineyards along with its escort. Ladesh had its silk monopoly, but anyone who wanted great wine bought it from Seth. To Solon, like most Sethi, the vineyards were rich not only with beauty, but also with meaning. The cycle of planting and grafting and pruning and nurturing and waiting all resonated with meaning for every citizen. They came over the last rise, and Solon saw Whitecliff Castle for the first time in 12 years. It was white marble, the testament to the vast wealth the empire had enjoyed at its height. No white marble was quarried on the islands, and shipping it across an ocean was so expensive that every time Solon saw the castle, he was awed and almost ashamed of his ancestors' wastefulness. Outbuildings, smithies, barracks, servants' housing, barns, kennels, granaries, and storehouses ringed the hill cheek by jowl within the granite walls. But the crown of the hill was all castle. Steps broad enough for horses led up the first tier into the outer hall. The outer hall had a roof but no walls, leaving it oddly open to the elements. Enormous grooved marble pillars held a majestic roof of marble, onyx, and stained glass. At the base of the steps, Oshobi drew his team to a halt.
Are you gonna make this easy or hard?
I'm here to solve problems, not cause them.
Too late for that. There's a room for you on the first floor.
Solon nodded. A visiting noble would be put on the second floor, and he should have raided the third floor. But it was better than the dungeon, and it would give Katie time to decide what to do about him. They climbed the steps together, drawing only a few looks. Oshobi was obviously a familiar sight, and Solon's clothing was Cenarian, not Sethi. So, from a distance, he supposed the lack of rings wasn't remarkable. Besides, it was almost harvest time, and everyone had too many things to do. Sky Watchers had aided the construction of the outer hall, so the stained glass panels provided art appropriate to the season. Currently, the sun lit the whole outer hall purple with scenes of harvest and grape crushing. Women dancing in vats with their skirts held up higher above their ankles than absolutely necessary, and men clapping and cheering them on. Elsewhere, there were scenes of war, of sailing, of fishing, of grand balls, of festivals to Nisus. Some of the panels were brighter than others, reminding Solon of when he was a boy, and a rare hailstorm had broken dozens of the panels. He remembered his father cursing their ancestors. Who would use glass for a ceiling? Of course, there was no choice but to replace the broken panels, though the price was ruinous. One couldn't let one's entryway fall into a shambles. Oshobi and Solon walked through the great black oak doors into the inner entry. Here, white staircases framed each side of the room. A great imperial purple carpet led further into the palace, and gold and marble statuary lined the hall. As they headed past the stairs to a side door, however, one of the smallest, oldest men Solon had ever seen came to Oshobi. The man stopped before he said anything, however, and gaped at Solon. He was the old Wariyamo chamberlain, a slave who had chosen to stay with the family permanently rather than take his freedom on the 7th year, and he obviously recognized Solon. After a moment, he recovered and whispered to Oshobi, who promptly reversed direction and gestured for Solon to follow him into the Great Hall. They walked through the Great Hall, past decorative geometric patterns and starbursts, all designed with swords and spears. It was another wasteful display meant to send a message to visiting emissaries. We have so many armaments, we decorate with them. It was, Solon thought, a more reasonable waste than the stained glass. The Great Hall was empty, except for the guards at the far door, and both of them were too young to recognize Solon. They opened the doors to the inner court promptly, so Oshobi wouldn't even have to slow. Oshobi led Solon past the great throne from which Solon's father and brother had ruled, and headed into the inner court. The doors opened at the base of stairs braced by lions. They ascended 21 steps, and Solon felt his throat tightening. Then he saw her. Katie Wariyamo had black hair and perfect olive skin. Her eyes were deep brown, nose stately, mouth wide and full, neck slender. In keeping with the impending harvest, her hair was bound in a single tail, and her nagika was simple cotton. A nagika was a dress that looped over one shoulder, the cloth gathering to the opposite hip and falling along to the floor, fully covering the ankles, leaving one breast bare. It wasn't, as Solon had explained to Midkiri on numerous occasions, that Sethi men didn't find breasts pleasing or innately feminine. They simply weren't erotic in the same way. In Seth, a man would comment on a woman's breasts as a Midkiran commented on a woman's eyes. But after 10 years in Midkiru, Solon's pulse quickened to see the woman he loved and who'd once loved him so exposed. Katie was 28 years old now. and most of the innocent girl he had known had receded from her face. The intelligence had come more to the fore, and a steel that had once been buried deep now lay close to the surface. The holes of the clan piercings on her right cheek had long closed, but the dimples remained, showing the world she had not been born an empress. Solon thought she was more beautiful than ever. He remembered the day he had left to train with the Magi. He had kissed that slender neck, caressed those breasts. He could still remember the smell of her hair. It had been in this very room where they thought no one would find them. He had wondered often when she would have made him stop, or if, but they'd never found out. Her mother, Don Wariamo, had found them and berated them both, calling him such foul names that had he been a little older, he would have thrown her from the palace. Nor had she spared her daughter the vitriol. Solon had failed Katie there. He had allowed his own shame to keep him from protecting Katie, who was even younger and more vulnerable. It was only the first of his regrets with her.
Oh, Katie, your beauty would shame the very stars. Why did you never write?
The sudden softness in her eyes steeled.
Guards! Take this bastard to the dungeon!
Men were gathering in the great yard before the city's south gate when Kyler arrived. The Queen's messengers canceling the attack wouldn't arrive for a few more minutes. Kyler was almost certain that they would. However, Durzo had taught him that when you deal with human beings, never count on logic or consistency. Either way, Kyler's work wasn't finished. The Sakurai were still sleeping. Kyler didn't make the mistake of thinking that this meant the morning's attack would take them off guard. They simply could sleep in and still slaughter Cenarians without missing breakfast. The sleet had stopped, so Kyler was able to make good time to Lantano Garawashi's tent. The war leader was asleep on a simple mat on one side of the room. Kyler stopped at a table full of maps. He'd never seen such detailed maps. There were maps of the city with 3 different colors of blocks put on different objectives. Kyler wasn't even sure what the colors signified. There were maps of the city's surroundings with elevations marked, the conditions of roads labeled, and a remarkably accurate chart of the smugglers' archipelago. Blocks with regimental flags stuck in them represented the various forces arrayed within and without the city, even the new rabbit regiments, which meant they already had spies in the city who were managing to pass messages out. There were broader national maps, with both knowns and unknowns marked. They didn't know who held Screaming Winds in the north. They weren't sure of the Lycanaut strength in the southeast. But on the last map were blocks representing Cenaria's death. Blocks on that national map represented Logan's force, guessed to be slightly larger than it was, and behind them, Curran reinforcements.
I'm not a general. I'm only a killer. And a fool.
Kyler had glanced at what was in front of his eyes and thought he had a more accurate view of the situation than the city's generals. Lantano Garawashi had rushed to the city without horses or baggage, but that didn't mean he hadn't told them to follow. He had. They were just a few days out, behind Logan's army, and Logan had never seen them. In the meantime, Garawashi had already dispatched a contingent of Sakurai to skirt Logan's force and go back to guard the supply train. Among the papers were plans to hire pirates to cut off smugglers' routes into the city and others to encourage insurrection in the Warrens. They were already in negotiations with the Sakage, which the generals knew had smuggling routes into the city. Currently, the Sakage wasn't offering good terms, but the generals were confident that the Sakage's offers would get sweeter as soon as the supply train arrived and the hungry Cenarians watched them feast. Kyler felt sicker the more he read. Of course the Sakage would treat with the Currans. It was one thing to refuse to collaborate with Caledorans who wanted to wipe out all of Cenaria, quite another to betray a disliked queen to a reasonable man who wouldn't interfere with the Sakage's business. As soon as that supply train arrived, Mama Kay would see the end. She would try to minimize the bloodshed, but which was better? For thousands to starve in the Warrens, or for 100 noble heads to roll? The smuggling tunnels would soon fill with Sakurai.
Night Angel.
Lantano Garawashi rose from his mat. Checking, Kyla was sure he was still invisible. He looked at the papers in his hand, apparently hanging in midair. He dropped the invisibility.
Good morning, War Leader.
Montano Garawashi was one of the rare men who looked more daunting half-naked than he did in full armor. There was no fat on his body, and where most quick swordsmen were built with lean muscles like Kyler, Garawashi had the upper body of a blacksmith, each muscle sharply defined and big. He had a smattering of scars on arms and chest and stomach, but not one of them was deep enough to have cut muscle and thereby impede his motion. They were the wounds of a man whose mistakes had been infrequent and small. Montano Garawashi grinned joylessly at Kyler.
I've been expecting you.
If you expected me, there'd be 50 Sakurai ringing this tent.
I knew you were coming as soon as my sentry reported that someone tied his leggings together.
He reported himself?
Garawashi smiled, self-satisfied. Kyler wanted to think of him as smug, but it was an infectious kind of smile.
I punished him lightly and rewarded him well, as he expected.
So if you expected me, all this is gutter shite.
Kyler dropped the papers on the table.
There's no supply train.
It's coming. If you don't believe me, wait 2 days. You tell me, do you all think those reports could have been written between the time you were playing with my sentry and now? That would be a massive effort, wouldn't it? And it would be stupid of me to throw it away by telling you I expected you.
So what's the game?
Garawashi began pulling on his clothes.
Oh, are we being honest with each other?
Might be quicker than lying.
I'm preparing to be a king, Night Angel.
A high king?
You say this like it means something to you.
A rumor, I heard.
Why would I wish to be a high king? Sonaria and Korra are neither large nor distant from each other. Naming under kings would simply give me rivals.
He waved it away and tied the thin silk robe around his waist.
In a year, I will be king of Korra. I have a reputation now, and most of it serves my purposes. But in our capital, Anu, the effete nobles call me a barbarian. Skilled at war, yes, but can a butcher be king? This is how they attack a man who is too excellent. So I have a small interest in capturing this city without killing. I'll let you read long enough to see that, yes?
So what do you want?
Surrender, unconditionally. I will give you my word to be merciful. We will leave in the spring to claim my throne, and once I take it, I'll grant this realm once more to your queen.
Kyler couldn't stop a twitch of annoyance.
You prefer Duke Geyer to be made king? Done! I'll even restore half of the royal treasury. Beyond this, my men will spend the winter wiping out the Sakage. Tell me, is not that alone worth the price of feeding and housing us? Is it not worth more than half the treasury?
You would have Sonaria trust you. You're saying this to a people who recently suffered under the most brutal tyrant imaginable?
It is a difficulty. We can do this however you please, but if my men must pay for this city with their blood, they will take blood in return. Take those papers to the Queen. Take a few days to see if I'm bluffing. And by the way, this attack this morning, that's not a good idea. Send these rabbits after sword lords, and the siege will end today.
It's cancelled already. Stupid idea.
So you do have the power to change things. I'd wondered.
It was a throwaway comment, but it struck Kyler.
How the fuck did I get here?
Kyler was blithely negotiating for tens of thousands of lives and the fate of a country. How would Logan take it? Kyler could obey the letter of his oath, and everyone except Terra would win. He wouldn't kill Terra. Montano Garawashi would do it for him. Garawashi was an honorable man, but that wasn't the same as a good man. The current culture didn't require him to be apologetic about craving power. He would be true to his oaths. He would be merciful, by his own definition of mercy, and Kyler had no chance to get to know him well enough to know what that was. The current nobles called him a barbarian. What if they were right? But Sonaria had more than lives at stake. Kyler hadn't stayed in the city long after killing God King Ursul, but everyone had been brimming with stories and pride about the Nocta Hamata. Sonaria had been burnt to the ground, and something good was trying to grow in the ashes. Was Sonaria a land where the small became great despite overwhelming odds, as they had in the Nocta Hamata and the Battle of Pavil's Grove? or were they Midkiru's whipping boy, doomed to be overrun by their neighbors, fending off aggression only through the threat of such deep corruption that no one would want to rule them? There were great souls in Cenaria. Mama Kay and Logan and Count Drake and Durzo were giants. Could they not be heroes as they might be in another country? Couldn't a scarred Rabel have been a lauded soldier instead of a hired killer? Kyler thought so. But two things stood in the way: this man's invasion and Tara Grayson.
I'm afraid I can't let you do this.
Fully dressed now, Lantano Garawashi tucked his thumbs into his sash, which would normally hold his swords. It must have been habit, a not-so-subtle hint to whoever challenged him of Garawashi's prowess. He removed his thumbs nonchalantly.
Oh! Are you going to kill me? I should find it difficult to fight an invisible man, but I thought we'd covered this ground already.
Kyler ignored him. He was looking past the current to the man's bed mat. There, for all the world looking like Kur Kalestos, was a sword in its scabbard. A sword that Lantano Garawashi hadn't tucked into his sash. A sword that Kyler had thrown into Ezra's wood.
Nice sword.
Lantano Garawashi flushed. Though he smiled to cover it immediately with his fair skin, it couldn't be hidden.
Whatever will your men say when they find out it's a fake? You have a vested interest in not spilling blood? How about a vested interest in not drawing your sword?
Given the circumstances, Kyler thought Lantano Garawashi mastered his rage rather well. His eyes went dead and his muscles relaxed. It wasn't the relaxation of a sluggard, but of a swordsman's relaxation. Kyler had heard that Garawashi once ripped out an opponent's throat before the man could draw his sword. He hadn't believed that an untalented man could do such a thing. Now he reconsidered. Lantano Garawashi didn't attack, though. Instead, he merely picked up his false Kur Kalestos and tucked it into his belt. He forced a marginally pleasant expression to his face.
I have a secret of yours, Night Angel. You have an entire identity built as Kyler Stern. You wouldn't wish to lose that, would ya? All your friends, all your access to the kinds of things the Night Angel couldn't find out on his own.
Remind me to thank Fear for that. It would hurt me in any number of ways to lose Kyler Stern, but Kyler Stern isn't all I have or all I am. I can change my name.
Changing a name is no great thing. In Kura we know this. We sometimes do it to commemorate great events in our land. But a face, that is something else entirely, isn't it?
Losing my identity will cost me years of effort. On the other hand, if you can't draw your sword, you can't lead your men at all, no matter how overwhelming your strength is. I know Kura well enough to know that the king can't rule with an iron sword, and there's no such thing as an Akuran Sakurai.
Lantano Garawashi raised an eyebrow. He glanced at the sheathed sword on his hip.
If you wish to reprise our duel in the wood, I will oblige. Vir Kusat went into the wood that day after my sword. As none ever has before, he returned on my word as a Sakurai. I'll still bear Kur Kalestos. If you force me to draw it, I will sate its spirit with your blood.
It was a serious oath, but the words of his vow didn't mean what he wanted Kyler to infer.
You bear nothing but a scabbard and a hilt. Say that I lie, Garawashi, and I'll stand before your tent and challenge you before your army. Your Sakurai will tear you apart with their bare hands when they find you've lost Kur Kalestos.
Curse you! Curse you for taking my sword, and curse Fear for making me live! He did come out of the wood. He said he'd been chosen to make another Kur Kalestos for me. He knew the Sakurai would never understand, so he gave me this hilt and swore to return by spring, and I believed him. And now you come again to destroy me. I don't know whether to hate you or admire you, Night Angel. I almost had you. I saw it in your face. Do you never run out of tricks?
You don't even want Cenaria, do you? You just thought it would be another quick victory that would make your legend grow.
What is a war leader without war, Night Angel? I was invincible before I took Kur Kalestos. And now you wish me to lose against Cenaria? You don't know what it is to lead men.
I know what it is to kill them. I know what it is to ask others to pay for my mistakes.
Do you know what it is to refuse to be satisfied with the meager portion life hands ya? Huh? I think you do. Can you imagine me squatting in a field next to my one servant with my trousers rolled up picking rice? These hands were not made for a hoe. You took this name, Kyler Stern. Why? Because you were born with an iron sword, too. My men need food, but they need victory more. With me or without me, they are here for the winter. The tunnels we widened to get through the mountains are river and ice now. If you expose me, the Sakurai will kill me. But then what? They will vent their fury on your people. For everyone's sake, Night Angel, let that go. Go instead and tell this queen to surrender. I give you my word that if she does this, not a single Cenarian will die. We will take nothing more than food and a place to winter. She'll be granted her throne once more when we leave in the spring.
And you won't ask for anything else once you have Cenarian and Kur Kalesto's birth, right? You'll surrender.
I can't. In surrender, even Cenarians lay down their swords at the victor's fate.
Kyler hadn't thought of that. It wasn't the thought of surrender that was impossible for Lantano Garawashi. It was the physical act.
Maybe there's a third way.
When Dorian's half-brother Peirik had brought his army to Kaliras to seize the throne, he had abandoned a vital post. The general who had served under him, General Talwyn Naga, stood in front of the throne explaining how the wild men would invade in the spring.
60,000 of them? How could they raise so many?
Raise may be exactly the word, Your Holiness.
The speaker was a tiny Lodakari man who had accompanied General Naga.
Who are you?
This is Ashaya Vul. He was your father Raptos Morgai, keeper of the dead. I think you'll need to hear what he can tell you.
I've never heard of such an office.
And Raptus didn't primarily mean keeper either. It meant taker, stealer. Dorian's stomach turned.
By your father's order and his father's before him, it was a quiet office, Your Holiness.
Ashaya Vul was utterly bald, with a knobby skull and a pinched face with nearsighted eyes, though he looked barely 40 years old.
I was known only as the Keeper. Your father's hands discouraged questions.
The hands? There was another problem. Whoever led the informers, torturers, spies, and guards who served as the God King's 1,000 hands had yet to show himself. Regardless, Dorian doubted Ashaya Vul would dare lie about them.
Go on.
I think you may want to come with me, Your Holiness. I suggest you leave your guard here.
Is this the first attempt on my life?
If so, it was rather clumsy. That made it all the more impossible to refuse. When the attempts on Dorian's life began, he had to defeat them ruthlessly. Then they would end.
Very well.
Dorian signaled the guards to stay and dismissed the general. In the hall, they immediately ran into Janine.
My lord, I'm so glad to see you.
Janine gave him a version of a Caladoran bow mixed with a Cenarian curtsy, chin up, eyes closing demurely, only for a moment, right hand sweeping into the Caladoran courtier's flourish, while the left hand flared her skirt as she curtsied. She made the mixed curtsy look graceful, too. Obviously, she'd practiced it.
My lady, the pleasure is mine. How may I serve you?
I was hoping to spend the day with you. I don't want to be in your way, I just want to learn.
Dorian glanced at Ashaya Vul. The man, of course, had his eyes averted. He wouldn't dare to disapprove of a God King's decisions, or to even look at a God King's woman.
I am afraid I'm going to see something remarkably unpleasant. You don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. You should probably wait in the throne room. I'll be back shortly.
I do want to see it! 1,000 pardons, my lord. I spoke hastily. Forgive my rudeness. My father never looked at things he didn't want to see. And it got him and my whole family killed, our country laid waste. Dealing with things we don't like is part of ruling. My father refused to do it because he was weak and venal. How else am I to learn if not from you?
What I'm going to see is beyond anything your father had to deal with, real or imagined.
Even so.
Dorian loved her strength, even as it surprised him.
Very well. Ashaya, show us what you are going to show me alone. All of it.
Ashaya Vol said nothing, pretended to have no opinion. And maybe, in fact, he had no opinion. A God King's unwelcome order was like a day of unwelcome weather. You might not like it, but you didn't have any illusions that you could change it either. So Ashaya took them deep into the bowels of the citadel, and then into the tunnels of the mountain itself. Dorian could smell beer on the man, though not much. He was at best a Meister of the Third Shura. Finally, Ashaya Vol stopped in front of a door that looked like any of the hundreds of others this deep in the citadel. The dust in this hall was so thick it was more like soil, and it was plain that this room hadn't been visited any more recently than any of the others. Dorian held his veer as he followed the Lodrakari into the darkness. His first sensation was that this room was huge, cavernous. The air was musty, thick, fetid.
Lightbringer.
A light coursed up the arch where Asaya held his hand against the wall. It spread from arch to arch across a painted ceiling over 100 feet above. In a few seconds, light bathed the chamber. This had been a library once, a place of beauty and light. The walls and pillars were the color of ivory and lace. The mural was like something out of a forgotten legend. Light coming out of darkness, creation. It gave a sense of divinity and purpose. Long cherry shelves had once held both scrolls and books, and tables had been arranged with space for scholars to study. Now, it held clean, white bones. The chamber was hundreds of paces long and half as wide, and everywhere the books and scrolls had been removed. In their place, on every shelf, on every table, were bones. Old bones. Some shelves held entire skeletons, labeled with tags tied to their wrists. Some held skeletons of human bones, but arranged in inhuman shapes. But mostly, the shelves held matching bones, with boxes for the small ones. An entire shelf of femurs, boxes of finger bones, pelvises stacked, spines whole and in boxes for each vertebrae, and skulls in a large central area. Mountains of skulls.
What is this?
Should the wild men invade, this is your salvation, your holiness. It is your corpusarium. When General Narka speaks of the clans raising an army, this is what he means. 2 years ago, a barbarian chieftain found an ancient mass grave and discovered a secret we had thought was ours alone.
Raising the dead?
Sort of, your holiness.
Sort of?
The souls of men are inviolate. We don't have the power to bind men's souls to their bodies. Your predecessors tried to make themselves immortal doing that, but it never worked well. This is different. We call it raising because we use the bones of the dead and unite them with a kind of spirit we call the strangers. The result is the Krull. They were originally called the Fallen because whenever they fall in battle, they can be raised again if a Verdmeister is present.
Take me one step at a time.
It starts in the pits. It always has. The God Kings have always said that the ore beneath Kaliras was powerful, and that's why the slaves and criminals and captured enemies are forced to work there. It's a lie. We don't need their service. We don't need the ore. We need the prisoners' bones and their agony. Their bones give us a frame. Their agony draws the strangers.
What are these strangers?
We don't know. Some of them have been here for millennia, but despite the length of their experiences, we are a puzzle to them. They don't have physical bodies, though my master said that once they walked the earth, took lovers, and had children who were the heroes of old, the Nephilim. The Southrons claimed the name was because the strangers were once children of their one god who was thrown out of heaven.
What happened?
We don't know. But the strangers long to wear flesh again. So we take the bones of our dead and sanctify them for the strangers' use. Incidentally, this is why God Kings have themselves cremated. They wish to avoid our use of their bones.
And then?
Real bones are necessary, but not sufficient to give the fallen a sense of embodiment. And it is for embodiment that they trade their service. We give them flesh. It doesn't have to look human. Some God Kings believed that any shape is possible. Putting human bones into a horse's or a dog's shape. It makes binding the fallen more difficult, as they wish to be men, not horses. But it makes a fine horse.
And the musculature, the skin, and so forth. Does it need to be crafted as painstakingly as the skeletons?
Given the correct skeleton and enough clay and water, the strangers help the magic form muscles and ligaments and skin. They're never as sturdy as man. God King Roygaris was able to craft coal that lived for a decade or more, but he was a brilliant anatomist. He was able to make Krull horses and wolves and tigers and mammoths and other creatures we no longer have names for.
They function like living beings.
They are living beings, Your Holiness. They breathe, they eat, they defecate. They just don't feel as men do. Pain that would incapacitate a man will do nothing to them. They won't complain about hunger. They will mention it if it's gone long enough that they are about to stop functioning.
They speak?
Poorly, but they can see better in the dark than a man, though not as far. Eyes are difficult to make correctly. They make poor archers. They have emotions, but the palate is different from men's. Fear is incredibly rare. They know that as long as the line of God Kings survives, if their body is destroyed, they will most likely be put into another, sooner or later.
Are they obedient?
Perfectly, in most circumstances. But they have an incredible hatred toward the living. They won't help build anything, not even engines of war. They only destroy. Experiments have been tried where a Krull was put in a room with a prisoner and told that if he killed the prisoner, he would be killed in turn. Every time, the Krull killed the prisoner. It was tried with women, with old men, with children. It didn't matter, except they killed children more quickly. You couldn't ask them to take a city and not kill those who surrendered. They also hunger for human flesh. Eating it seems to make them stronger. We don't know why.
My father gathered these bones, but never used them.
Your pardon, Your Holiness. Your esteemed father did use them. Once, when Clan Hill rebelled. Afterward, he noted that the Hill fought to the last man when they knew they would be eaten and profaned. Your father said he wished to have men left alive to rule. The Krull wished only for ashes. He held them off for a great emergency. The emergency never came, so there's quite a stockpile.
How many do we have?
About 85,000. When we organize them, we have to preserve their hierarchy. Their number system is different than ours.
What do you mean?
Even our words for numbers are predicated on multiples of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. Their number system is based on 13. My master said that was where our superstitions about 13 come from. They're rigidly bound to those numbers. A Meister can lead 12 Krull himself, but if he wishes to lead 13 or more, he must master a 13th, which is different. A white Krull called a demon. The white Krull are faster, over 6 feet tall, and take more magic to raise. Platoons are 13 squads, 169 Krull. So after you raise 13 squads, if you wish to add a single Krull, you must raise a Bone Lord. Bone Lords speak well. They're smarter, tough, and they can use magic.
Beer?
No. It's either their talent or very similar. 13 Bone Lords make a legion. If you don't lead it yourself, a legion needs a fiend. 13 fiends make an army, 28,561 Kroll. Your Holiness has enough for 3 armies, if you can master 2 arcane ghouls to lead the other 2 armies. All told, that gives you a force of more than 85,000.
What would happen if I had 13 arcane ghouls? What is that? Close to 400,000 Krell?
I don't know, Your Holiness.
Has it ever been tried? I won't have you lie to me.
The only rumors I've heard about that are blasphemous, Your Holiness.
As God King, I pardon your blasphemy.
My predecessor, Keeper Jurgen, said that the first of your line, God King Roygaris, tried. He needed hundreds of thousands of skeletons for the attempt, so he invaded what is now the Freeze. Keeper Jurgen said it was once a great civilization, filled with mighty cities. Roygaris took it with little difficulty, for they thought him their ally, and then he put them in camps and killed them all, an entire civilization. Keeper Jurgen said that above the 13 arcane ghouls, God King Roygaris found a rank he called Night Lords. With 1 Night Lord, Roygaris conquered the rest of the Freeze, and his armies only grew. He couldn't be content. He thought he was closing in on the mysteries of the universe. He thought if he could master 13 Night Lords, he would master God. I can't imagine that there were ever so many people in all the world. But my master told me that he succeeded in capturing and putting to death almost 5 million people. And that there, above the Night Lords, he found Kali. She destroyed him and became our goddess. She gave us the Veer to bind us to her and make us destroyers. This is why Agony is worship to her, because like all the strangers, she hates life.
What happened to Shire?
Jorsin Alcestis.
Dorian's heart went cold. He'd heard this history, but only from the southern perspective. The Mad Emperor and the Mad Mage. The Conqueror and his dog. Now Ashaya was saying that Jorsin and Ezra had stopped a goddess and her army of 5 million Kroll.
Elsewhere, our armies would suffer losses in the day and be remade in the night. That alone made us almost invincible. But Alcestis somehow warded all of the great city of Treathel and leagues around it, so that the Kroll couldn't be raised there.
Black Barrel?
The city was in southeast Calador, but it had never been inhabited. It was cursed. No one lived within leagues of the place. Indeed, all of eastern Calador was sparsely populated.
Who else knows about these bones and about the Krell?
I have a number of deaf mutes who assist me. We take all the castles and the cities dead. I never allow anyone in the larger chambers. Peirik and Moburu were the only Aethelings who knew. General Naga learned it from Peirik. No one else.
No one else.
So Peirik wasn't a fool. With 20,000 men, he was facing 60,000. Peirik didn't come here for the throne, or at least not only for the throne. He came for the Kroll. What does it mean, my lord?
Dorian felt sick. Janine seized on exactly the crux of it.
My father suffered a huge setback by being stalled in Scenaria. It was a distraction, a mistake. He thought he could grab it and send home riches and food. But the supplies he hoped to send home were put to the torch instead by the fleeing Cenarians. So when the barbarians come down from the Freeze, Kalirash will be indefensible. Its citizens would want to cross Luxbridge and live here in the Citadel. As they wait out the siege, they'll have to be fed, and we have no food. Our military is good at following orders, but no good at taking initiative. If I throw them into a battle facing 3-1 odds, they'll get massacred. Oh, there's no way to win.
You mean there's no way to win except...
Yes, there's no way to win except to raise these monsters. It will be an orgy of death.
Whose deaths? The invaders or your innocent people's?
The invaders.
Then let us raise monsters.